we're back again with Matilda. I am so sorry. It has been a really long time since I've posted. I had some phone issues, and my phone is actually what I'm recording on right now. So I had to get those figured out before I could start recording these videos again. But we are back with Matilda today, and we finished up last time reading about Miss Honey and Mrs. Trunchbull. And I don't think you could get more different characters if you tried. Miss Honey is sweet and kind, and she's Matilda's first teacher, and Mrs. Trunchbull is kind of the principal of the school. This takes place in England, so they don't have principals, they have like headmistresses, and she is not very nice. Miss Honey comes to her to try and tell her, hey, Matilda's really talented, but Mrs. Trunchbull is not having it, and she thinks that Matilda is causing trouble instead because her father, who's also not so kind, has already told her that Matilda's kind of a troublemaker, even though she's really not too much of one. Okay, unless she's trying to get back at her parents. She's pulled a few pranks so far. Today's chapter that we're going to start with is called The Parents. When Miss Honey emerged from the headmistress's study, most of the children were outside in the playground. Her first move was to go round to the various teachers who taught the senior class and borrow from them a number of textbooks, books on algebra, geometry, French, English literature, and the like. Then she sought out Matilda and called her into the classroom. There is no point, she said, in you sitting in class doing nothing while I am teaching the rest of the form, the 2 times tables, and how to spell cat and rat and mouse. So during each lesson, I shall give you one of these textbooks to study. At the end of the lesson, you can come up to me with your questions if you have any, and I shall try to help you. How does that sound? Thank you, Miss Honey, Matilda said. That sounds fine. I am sure, Miss Honey said, that we'll be able to get you moved into a much higher form later on. But for the moment, the headmistress wishes you stay where you are. Very well, Miss Honey, Matilda said. Thank you so much for getting these books for me. What a nice child she is, Miss Honey thought. I don't care what her father said about her. She seems very quiet and gentle to me, and not a bit stuck up in spite of her brilliance. In fact, she hardly seems aware of it. So when the class reassembled, Matilda went to her desk and began to study a textbook on geometry which Miss Honey had given her. The teacher kept half an eye on her all the time and noticed that the child very soon became deeply absorbed in the book. She never glanced up once during the entire lesson. Miss Honey, meanwhile, was making another decision. She was deciding that she would go herself and have a secret talk with Matilda's mother and father as soon as possible. She simply refused to let the matter rest where it was. The whole thing was ridiculous. She couldn't believe that the parents were totally unaware of their daughter's remarkable talents. After all, Mr. Wormwood was a successful motor car dealer, so she presumed that he was a fairly intelligent man himself. In any event, parents never underestimated the abilities of their own children. Quite the reverse. Sometimes it was well nigh impossible for a teacher to convince the proud father or mother that their beloved offspring was a complete nitwit. Miss Honey felt confident that she would have no difficulty in convincing Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that Matilda was something very special indeed. The trouble was going to be to stop them from getting over-enthusiastic. And now Miss Honey's hopes began to expand even further. She started wondering whether permission might not be sought from the parents for her to give private tuition to Matilda after school. The prospect of coaching a child as bright as this appealed enormously to her professional instinct as a teacher. And suddenly she decided that she would go and call on Mr. and Mrs. Wormwood that very evening. She would go fairly late, between 9 and 10 o'clock, when Matilda was sure to be in bed. All right, so Miss Honey is planning on going to Matilda's house right now and explaining to her parents that she is a very brilliant, a bright child, and that she wants to tutor her after school. However, as we remember, her parents aren't the kindest, so let's think about how we think this is going to go in the story. Probably not so well. And that is precisely what she did. Having got the address from the school records, Miss Honey set out to walk from her own home in the Wormwood's house, to the Wormwood's house shortly after 9. She found the house in a pleasant street where each smallish building was separated from its neighbors by a bit of garden. It was a modern brick house that could not have been cheap to buy, and the name on the gate said Cozy Nook. Nosy Cook might have been better, Miss Honey thought. She was given to playing with words in that way. She walked up the path and rang the bell, and while she stood waiting, she could hear the television blaring inside. The door was opened by a small, ratty-looking man with a thin, ratty mustache who was wearing a sports coat that had an orange and red stripe on the material. "Yes," he said, peering out at Miss Honey. "If you're selling raffle tickets, I don't want any." "I'm not," Miss Honey said, "and please forgive me for butting in on you like this. I am Matilda's teacher at school, and it is important I have a word with you and your wife." "Got into trouble already, has she?" Mr. Wormwood said, blocking the doorway. "Well, she's your responsibility from now on. You'll have to deal with her." So there's Miss Honey at the door, and there's Mr. Wormwood not looking quite so happy that she came to visit. "She's in no trouble at all," Miss Honey said. "I have come with good news about her. Quite startling news, Mr. Wormwood. Do you think I might come in for a few minutes and talk to you about Matilda?" "We are right in the middle of watching one of our favorite programs," Mr. Wormwood said. "This is most inconvenient. Why don't you come back some other time?" Miss Honey began to lose patience. "Mr. Wormwood," she said, "if you think some rotten TV program is more important than your daughter's future, then you ought not to be a parent. Why don't you switch the darn thing off and listen to me?" That shook Mr. Wormwood. He was not used to being spoken to in this way. He peered carefully at the slim, frail woman who stood so resolutely out on the porch. "Oh, very well then," he snapped. "Come on in and let's get it over with." Miss Honey stepped briskly inside. "Mrs. Wormwood isn't going to thank you for this," the man said as he led her into the sitting room where a large platinum blonde woman was gazing rapturously to the TV screen. "Who is it?" the woman said, not looking round. "Some school teacher," Mr. Wormwood said. "She says she's got to talk to us about Matilda." He crossed to the TV set and turned down the sound, but left the picture on the screen. "Don't do that, Harry," Mrs. Wormwood cried. "Willard is just about to propose to Angelica." "You can still watch it while we're talking," Mr. Wormwood said. "This is Matilda's teacher. She says she's got some good news to give us." "My name is Jennifer Honey," Miss Honey said. "How do you do, Mrs. Wormwood?" Mrs. Wormwood glared at her and said, "What's the trouble then?" Nobody invited Miss Honey to sit down, so she chose a chair and sat down anyway. "This," she said, "was your daughter's first day at school." "We know that," Mrs. Wormwood said, ratty about missing her program. "Is that all you came to tell us?" So there's Mrs. Wormwood in her chair, not too excited that she's missing out on her TV program. Miss Honey stared hard into the other woman's wet gray eyes, and she allowed the silence to hang in the air until Mrs. Wormwood became uncomfortable. "Do you wish me to explain why I came?" she said. "Get on with it then," Mrs. Wormwood said. "I'm sure you know," Miss Honey said, "that children in the bottom class at school are not expected to be able to read or spell or juggle with numbers when they first arrive. 5-year-olds cannot do that. But Matilda can do it all. And if I am to believe her—" "I wouldn't," Mrs. Wormwood said. She was still ratty at losing the sound on the TV. "Was she lying then?" Miss Honey said. "When she told me that nobody taught her to multiply or to read? Did either of you teach her?" "Teach her what?" Mr. Wormwood said. To read books," Miss Honey said. "Perhaps you did teach her. Perhaps she was lying. Perhaps you have shelves full of books all over the house. I wouldn't know. Perhaps you are both great readers." "Of course we read," Mr. Wormwood said. "Don't be so daft. I read the autocar and the motor from cover to cover every week." "This child has already read an astonishing number of books," Miss Honey said. "I was simply trying to find out if she came from a family that loved good literature." "We don't hold with book reading," Mr. Wormwood said. "You can't make a living from sitting on your fanny and reading storybooks. We don't keep them in the house." "I see," Miss Honey said. "Well, all I came to tell you was that Matilda has a brilliant mind, but I expect you knew that already." "Of course I knew she could read," the mother said. "She spends her life up in her room, buried in some silly book." "But does it not intrigue you," Miss Honey said, "that a little 5-year-old child is reading long adult novels by Dickens and Hemingway? Doesn't that make you jump up and down with excitement?" "Not particularly," the mother said. "I'm not in favor of blue-stocking girls. A girl should think about making herself look attractive so she can get a good husband later on. Looks is more important than books, Miss Hunky." "The name is Honey," Miss Honey said. "Now look at me," Mrs. Wormwood said. "Then look at you. You chose books. I chose looks." Miss Honey looked at the plain, plump person with the smug, suet pudding face who was sitting across the room. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said you chose books and I chose looks," Mrs. Wormwood said. "And who's finished up the better off? Me, of course. I'm sitting pretty in a nice house with a successful businessman, and you're left slaving away teaching a lot of nasty little children the ABC. "Quite right, Sugarplum," Mr. Wormwood said, casting a look of such simpering sloppiness at his wife it could have made a cat sick. Miss Honey decided that if she was going to get anywhere with these people, she must not lose her temper. "I haven't told you all of it yet," she said. "Matilda, so far as I can gather, is at this early stage, is also kind of a mathematical genius. She can multiply complicated figures in her head like lightning." "What's the point of that when you can buy a calculator?" Mr. Wormwood said. "A girl doesn't get a man by being brainy," Mrs. Wormwood said. "Look at that film star, for instance," she added, pointing to the silent TV screen where a blossoming female was being embraced by a craggy actor in the moonlight. "You don't think she got him to do that by multiplying figures at him, do you? Not likely. And now he's going to marry her. You see, if he doesn't, and she's going to live in a mansion with a butler and lots of maids." Miss Honey could hardly believe what she was hearing. She had heard that parents like this existed all over the place, and that their children turned out to be delinquents and dropouts, but it was still a shock to meet a pair of them in the flesh. "Matilda's trouble," she said, trying once again, "is that she's so far ahead of everyone else around her that it might be worth thinking about some extra kind of private tuition. I seriously believe that..." Oh, guys, I messed that one up. This one is actually being written by Miss Honey. "Matilda's trouble," she said, trying once again, "is that she's so far ahead of everyone else around her that it might be worth thinking about some extra kind of private tuition. I seriously believe that she could be brought up to university standard in 2 or 3 years with the proper coaching." "University?" Mr. Wormwood shouted, bouncing up in his chair. "Who wants to go to university, for heaven's sake? All they learn there is bad habits." Now, this is taking place in England. When they say university, they mean college. So they're saying that Matilda, this is what Miss Honey is saying, could probably be ready for college in just a couple of years, and she's only 5 years old. Her dad is not impressed by that. "That is not true," Miss Honey said. "If you had a heart attack this minute and had to call a doctor, that doctor would be a university graduate. If you got sued for selling someone a rotten secondhand car, you'd have to get a lawyer and he'd come from a university too. Do not despise clever people, Mr. Wormwood, but I can see we're not going to agree. I'm sorry I burst in on you like this." Miss Honey rose from her chair and walked out of the room. Mr. Wormwood followed her out the front door and said, "Good of you to come, Miss Hawks, or isn't Miss Harris?" "It's neither," Miss Honey said, "but let it go." And she went away. And they were not very excited for her to come and tell her all those good things about their kid. Very sad. All right, we're going to go ahead and read one more chapter today, Throwing the Hammer. The nice thing about Matilda was that if you had met her casually and talked to her, you would have thought she was a perfectly normal 5-and-a-half-year-old child. She displayed almost no outward signs of her brilliance, and she never showed off. "This is a very sensible and quiet little girl," you would have said to yourself And unless for some reason you had started a discussion with her about literature or mathematics, you would never have known the extent of her brain power. It was therefore easy for Matilda to make friends with other children. All those in her class liked her. They knew, of course, that she was clever, because they had heard her being questioned by Miss Honey on the first day of term. And they knew also that she was allowed to sit quietly with a book during lessons and not pay attention to the teacher. But children of their age do not search deeply for reasons. They are far too wrapped up in their own small struggles to worry overmuch about what others are doing and why. Among Matilda's newfound friends was the girl called Lavender. Right from the first day of term, the two of them started wandering around together during the morning break and into the lunch hour. Lavender was exceptionally small for her age, a skinny little nymph with deep brown eyes and with dark hair that was cut in a fringe across her forehead. Matilda liked her because she was a gutsy and adventurous girl. She liked Matilda for exactly the same reasons. Before the first week of term was up, awesome tales about the headmistress, Miss Trunchbull, began to filter through to the newcomers. Matilda and Lavender, standing in a corner of the playground during morning break on the third day, were approached by a rugged 10-year-old with a boil on her nose called Hortensia. That's how you say your name. "New scum, I suppose," Hortensia said to them, looking down from her great height. She was eating from an extra large bag of potato chips and digging the stuff out in handfuls. "Welcome to Borstal," she added, spraying bits of crisp out of her mouth like snowflakes. The two tiny ones, confronted by this giant, kept a watchful silence. "Have you met the Trunchbull yet?" Hortensia asked. "We've seen her at prayers," Lavender said, "but we haven't met her yet." "You've got a treat coming to you," Hortensia said. "She hates very small children. She therefore loathes the bottom class and everyone in it. She thinks 5-year-olds are grubs that haven't yet hatched out." In went another fistful of crisps, and when she spoke again, out sprayed the crumbs. "If you survive your first year, you may just manage to live through the rest of your time here." And that sentence keeps going. But let's go ahead and look over at this picture. So this is Hortensia. She's 10, and Matilda and Lavender are 5. So she's a lot bigger than them, and she's trying to scare them by telling them all about Mrs. Trunchbull. She is pretty scary. "If you survive your first year, you may just manage to live through the rest of your time here. But many don't survive. They get carried out on stretchers, screaming. I've seen it often." Hortensia paused to observe the effect these remarks were having on the two titchy ones. Not very much. They seemed pretty cool, so the large one decided to regale them with further information. "I suppose you know the Trunchbull has a lockup covered in her private quarters called the Chokey? Have you heard about the Chokey?" Matilda and Lavender shook their heads and continued to gaze up at the giant. Being very small, they were inclined to mistrust any creature that was larger than they were, especially senior girls. "The Chokey," Hortensia went on, "is a very tall but very narrow cupboard. The floor is only 10 inches square, so you can't sit down or squat in it. You have to stand. And 3 of the walls are made of cement with bits of broken glass sticking out all over, so you can't lean against them. You have to stand more or less at attention all the time when you get locked up in there. It's terrible." "Can't you lean against the door?" Matilda asked. "Don't be daft," Hortensia said. "The door's got thousands of sharp, spiky nails sticking out of it. They've been hammered through from the outside, probably by the Trunchbull herself." "Have you been in there?" Lavender asked. "My first term, I was in there 6 times. Hortensia said. "Twice for a whole day, and the other times for 2 hours each. But 2 hours is quite bad enough. It's pitch dark, and you have to stand up dead straight, and if you wobble at all, you get spiked either by the glass on the walls or the nails on the door." "Why were you put in?" Matilda asked. "What had you done?" "The first time," Hortensia said, "I poured half a tin of golden syrup on the seat of the chair of the Trunchbull that the Trunchbull was going to sit on at prayers. It was wonderful. When she lowered herself into the chair, there was a loud squelching noise similar to that made by a hippopotamus when lowering its foot into the mud on the banks of the Limpopo River. But you're too small and stupid to have read Just So stories, aren't you? I've read them, Matilda said. So there's Hortensia eating her chips, or they call them crisps in England, and trying to tell that story to those two little ones. You're a liar, Hortensia said amiably. You can't even read yet, but no matter. So when the Trunchbull sat down on the golden syrup, the squelch was beautiful. And when she jumped up again, the chair sort of stuck to the seat on those awful green breeches she wears and came up with her for a few seconds until the thick syrup slowly came unstuck. Then she clasped her hands to the seat of her breeches and both hands got covered in the muck. You should have heard her bellow. But how did she know it was you? Lavender asked. A little squirt called Ollie Bog Whistle sneaked on me, Hortensia said. I knocked his front teeth out. And the Trunchbull put you in the chokey for a whole day? Matilda asked, gulping. All day, Hortensia said. I was off my rocker when she let me out. I was babbling like an idiot. What were the other things you did to get put in the chokey? Lavender asked. Oh, I can't remember them all, Hortensia said. She spoke with the air of an old warrior who had been in so many battles that bravery had become commonplace. It's all so long ago, she added, stuffing more crisp into her mouth. Ah, yes, I can remember one. Here's what happened. I chose a time when I knew the Trunchbull was out of the way teaching for sixth formers, and I put up my hand and asked to go to the bogs. But instead of going there, I sneaked into the Trunchbull's room. And after a speedy search, I found the drawer where she kept all her gym knickers. Go on, Matilda said, spellbound. What happened next? I had sent away by post, you see, for this very powerful itching powder, Hortensia said. It cost 5 pence a packet and was called the Skin Scorcher. The label said it was made from the powdered teeth of deadly snakes, and it was guaranteed to raise welts the size of walnuts on your skin. So I sprinkled the stuff inside every pair of knickers in the drawer, and then folded them up again carefully. Hortensia paused to cram more crisp into her mouth. Now, if you're confused, knickers are underwear. So she went into her underwear drawer and poured all of this itchy powder on her underwear. Did it work? Lavender asked. Well, Hortensia said, a few days later, during prayers, the Trunchbull suddenly started scratching herself like mad. Aha, I said to myself, here we go. She's changed for gym already. It was pretty wonderful to be sitting there watching it all, knowing that I was the only person in the whole school who realized exactly what was going on inside the Trunchbull's pants. And I felt safe too. I knew I wouldn't be caught. Then the scratching got worse. She couldn't stop. She must have thought she had a wasp's nest. And then, right in the middle of the Lord's Prayer, she leapt up and grabbed her bottom and rushed out of the room. Both Matilda and Lavender were enthralled. It was quite clear to them that they were at this moment standing in the presence of a master. Here was somebody who had brought the art of sculpture to the highest point of perfection. Somebody, moreover, who was willing to risk life and limb in pursuit of her calling. They gazed in wonder at this goddess, and suddenly even the boil on her nose was no longer a blemish, but a badge of courage. But how did she catch you that time? Lavender asked, breathless with wonder. She didn't, Hortensia said, but I got a day in the chokey just the same. Why? They both asked. The Trunchbull, Hortensia said, has a nasty habit of guessing. When she doesn't know who the culprit is, she makes a guess at it, and the trouble is she's often right. I was the prime suspect this time because of the golden syrup job, and although I knew she didn't have any proof, nothing I said made any difference. I kept shouting, How could I have done it, Miss Trunchbull? I didn't even know you kept any spare knickers at school. I don't even know what itching powder is. I've never heard of it. But the lying didn't help me in spite of the great performance I put on. The Trunchbull simply grabbed me by one ear and rushed me to the chokey at the double and threw me inside and locked the door. That was my second all-day stretch. It was absolute torture. I was spiked and cut all over when I came out. It's like a war, Matilda said, overawed. You're darn right it's like a war, Hortensia cried, and the casualties are terrific. We are the Crusaders, and the gallant army fighting for our lives with hardly any weapons at all, and the Trunchbull is the prince of darkness, the foul serpent, the fiery dragon, with all the weapons at her command. It's a tough life. We all try to support each other. You can rely on us, Lavender said, making her height 3 feet 2 inches stretch as tall as possible. No, I can't, Hortensia said. You're only shrimps. But you never know. We may find a use for you one day in some undercover job. Tell us just a little bit more about what she does, Matilda said. Please do. I mustn't frighten you before you've been here a week, Hortensia said. You won't, Lavender said. We may be small, but we're quite tough. Listen to this then, Hortensia said. Only yesterday, the Trunchbull caught a boy called Julius Rotwinkle eating licorice allsorts during the scripture lesson, and she simply picked him up by one arm and flung him clear out the open classroom window. Our classroom is 1 floor up, and we saw Julius Rotwinkle go sailing out over the garden like a frisbee and landing with a thump in the middle of the lettuce. Then the Trunchbull turned on us and said, "From now on, anybody caught eating in class goes straight out the window." Did this Julius Rotwinkle break any bones? Lavender asked. Only a few, Hortensia said. You've got to remember that the Trunchbull once threw the hammer for Britain in the Olympics, so she's very proud of her right arm. What's throwing the hammer? Lavender asked. The hammer, Hortensia said, is actually a ruddy great cannonball on the end of a long bit of wire, and the thrower whisks it round and round his or her head faster and then lets it go. You have to be terrifyingly strong. The Trunchbull will throw anything around just to keep her arm in, especially children. Good heavens, Lavender said. I once heard her say, Hortensia went on, that a large boy is about the same weight as an Olympic hammer, and therefore he's very useful for practicing with. So here's the picture of poor Julius being thrown out his classroom window by the Trunchbull. At that point, something strange happened. The playground, which up to then had been filled with shrieks and the shouting of children at play, all at once became silent as the grave. Watch out, Hortensia whispered. Matilda and Lavender glanced round and saw the gigantic figure of Miss Trunchbull advancing through the crowd of boys and girls with menacing strides. The children drew back hastily to let her through, and her progress across the asphalt was like that of Moses going through the Red Sea when the waters parted. A formidable figure she was, too, in her belted smock and green breeches. Below her knees, her calf muscles stood out like grapefruits inside of her stockings. Amanda Thrip, she was shouting. You, Amanda Thrip, come here. Hold your hats, Hortensia whispered. What's going to happen? Lavender whispered back. That dummy Amanda, Hortensia said, has let her long hair grow even longer during the holes, and her mother has plaited it into pigtails. Silly thing to do. Why silly? Matilda asked. If there's one thing the Trunchbull can't stand, it's pigtails, Hortensia said. Matilda and Lavender saw the giant in green breeches advancing upon a girl about 10 who had a pair of plaited golden pigtails hanging over her shoulders. Each pigtail had a blue satin bow at the end of it, and it looked very pretty. The girl wearing the pigtails, Amanda Thrip, stood quite still, watching the advancing giant, and the expression on her face was one that you might find on the face of a person who was trapped in a small field with an enraged bull which is charging flat out towards her. So there's tiny little Amanda Thrip, and there's the Trunchbull. Not liking those pigtails. Oh no. The girl was glued to the spot, terror-struck, pop-eyed, quivering, knowing for certain that the day of judgment had come to her at last. Miss Trunchbull had now reached the victim and stood towering over her. "I want those filthy pigtails off before you come back to school tomorrow," she barked. "Chop 'em off and throw 'em in the dustbin, you understand?" Amanda, paralyzed with fright, managed to stutter. My mummy likes them. She plates them for me every morning." "Your mummy's a twit," the Trunchbull bellowed. She pointed a finger the size of a salami at the child head and shouted, "You look like a rat with a tail coming out of its head." "My mummy thinks I look lovely, Miss Trunchbull," Amanda stuttered, shaking like a... I can't read that word. A blancmange. "I don't think a tinker's toot what your mummy thinks," the Trunchbull yelled, and with that she lunged forward and grabbed hold of Amanda's pigtails with her right fist and lifted the girl clear off the ground. Then she started swinging her round and round her head, faster and faster, and Amanda was screaming blue murder, and the Trunchbull was yelling, "I'll give you pigtails, you little rat." "Shade of the Olympics," Hortensia muttered. "She's getting up speed now, just like she does with the hammer. 10-1, she's going to throw her." And now the Trunchbull was leaning back against the weight of the whirling girl and pivoting expertly on her toes, spinning round and round, and soon Amanda Thripp was traveling so fast she became a blur, and suddenly, with a mighty grunt, the Trunchbull let go of the pigtails and Amanda went sailing like a rocket right over the wire fence of the playground and high up into the sky. Oh my goodness. So there's Miss Trunchbull, and there's Amanda Thripp. Poor girl. "Well thrown, sir," someone shouted from across the playground, and Matilda, who was mesmerized by the whole crazy affair, saw Amanda Thripp descending in a long, graceful parabola onto the playing field beyond. She landed on the grass and bounced 3 times and finally came to rest. Then, amazingly, she sat up. She looked a trifle dazed, and who could blame her? But after a minute or so, she was on her feet again and tottering back towards the playground. The Trunchbull stood in the playground, dusting off her hands. "Not bad," she said, "considering I'm not in strict training. Not bad at all." Then she strode away. "She's mad," Hortensia said. "But the parents don't complain?" Matilda asked. "Would yours?" Hortensia asked. "I know mine wouldn't. She treats the mothers and fathers just the same as the children, and they're all scared to death of her. I'll be seeing you sometime, you two." And with that, she sauntered away. And there's poor Amanda Thripp, after being thrown like a hammer. All right, we're going to pause there for today. I hope you guys are having an amazing day today, and we will be back tomorrow with the next 2 chapters. Bye!